Welcome to the tutorial series on Dominator. Today we're going to get up and running, get set up, get from that Rust to HTML hello world on the screen. So there isn't really a Dominator compiler. Instead, there's Cargo or Rust-C, like the Rust compiler to get you from Rust to WebAssembly with the wasm-32 unknown target. Then after you have the WASM, like after you have the WebAssembly, there's a WASM bindgen tool to kind of load the WebAssembly and integrate it with the browser. And then there's wasm-opt, which strips that down and gives you nice, lean WebAssembly files so that they load quickly. These are really the three steps, and they apply to any WebAssembly for the browser project. It's not specific to Dominator. And it also doesn't really have any single tool that is the only way to do it. But it's a little bit hectic, like especially if you're going to CI and you want to have all of this build, in automated deployment, and you want to be able to also refresh the browser, have it reload whenever you make file changes. So you really want tooling that makes all of this a lot easier. The state of the art is constantly changing when it comes to bundlers and packagers and all these sorts of things. But there's two options here that I would seriously consider. One would be using the Rust rollup plugin, which was developed by Pawan, the author of Dominator and Future Signals. So it's kind of blessed in that sense, right? It's like part of the ecosystem here. The other option would be Trunk, which is a Rust tool that's focused on building WebAssembly applications for the browser. Either of these approaches, like using the rollup plugin or using Trunk, or even just doing your own task runner thing, like any of these can work. And at the end of the day, what you really need is just having the start directive in wasm bindgen. So jumping over to the terminal, let's get started and create our project. The first thing we want to do is we want to create a new cargo library, and that is a lib, not a binary. If we create a binary, it's just going to add a whole bunch of bloat that we don't need. For WebAssembly, we really want to target it as a lib. Now, if we open this up in the IDE, we'll see that the .getignore that Cargo generates does not include our node modules folder, of course, but it also doesn't include stuff for the operating system and maybe a couple other standard Rust things. So if we jump over to this repo hosted by GitHub itself for .getignore files, we'll see Rust and Node and OS X, Linux, Windows, and a lot of universal rules that you may already have set up for your defaults, but we're going to add them in just to kind of cover our bases. So now let's set up the rollup, HTML, JavaScript, like that whole side of things. So the first thing we want to do is we want to init a package.json, and we could do that with just yarn init. Now that we've got package.json initialized, we want to add in all our rollup dependencies. Primarily, that's rollup itself and our Rust rollup plugin, and of course, a few other helper utilities to kind of make development life easier, right? To be able to live reload and serve things and delete files, all that sort of stuff. Now that we've got all our rollup dependencies added, we need to edit the package.json to have our build script and our watch script so that we can compile everything whenever our files change. Now we could type this all out by hand, but let's just go copy paste from the examples repo on Dominator itself. All right, our package.json is done. Let's go ahead and add the rollup config now. We're just going to copy paste from the examples again and just use it as is. There's really nothing to change. It's absolutely fine. So pasting that in. That's it for rollup. Now we need a dist directory, and we'll copy paste the index.html again from the examples into here, but just change the title a bit. And that's it for the rollup JavaScript packaging side of things. Now we start getting into Rust. The first thing we need to do is add wasm bindgen as a cargo dependency. All right, now looking at our lib.rs, let's delete what's there, which is just the boilerplate that Cargo added for us. And now we start actually adding some Rust code. Use the wasm bindgen prelude, and then create a main entry point. We can actually call it anything, so we're going to call it main.js, but we need to give it a wasm bindgen start directive. Now, you should definitely go and check out the docs on wasm bindgen. This function can be async, it can return a result. It's really very powerful. And this is really the entry point, like the bootstrapping for our entire application. So from here, we can already yarn watch, and we're off to the races. We have a build that is loading in the browser, and we can look at the console log, but there's nothing there. So let's fix that. Logging in Rust is a rich and diverse ecosystem, but one of the more popular approaches is to use this log facade, which is a crate that gives you info, warning, error, like all these different macros, and it doesn't actually implement the logging facility itself. Instead, it just gives you this, again, what they call a facade, so that you can use it throughout your application code. And then if you want to change the implementation for what it actually does, you only have to configure it in one place. For our implementation, we're going to use wasm-logger with the default configuration, and this hooks up the log facade to the browser console. And so now we can see line numbers, we can see color coding, works with info, warn, and error, and everything is just fantastic. As fun as logging text in the console is, even with Rust line numbers, we want to start seeing some stuff on the screen, right? So let's add Dominator. Let's add Dominator. Now that we have Dominator installed, we want to create our top-level rendering route that everything flows from. This is very similar to in React, where you have create route and then you call .render on that. So we call append DOM, where the first parameter is the parent node that we're attaching to, and the second parameter is the child DOM element that everything flows from. Append DOM gives us back a DOM handle, and most of the time you can just ignore it. If we don't call .discard on it, then it'll leak forever. And that's actually what we want. This sort of manual cleanup is very, very rare, and it's only necessary here because we're really at the root of the application, and it's unlikely that you actually want it to ever clean up. Most of the time, as we'll see, everything follows drop semantics, things clean themselves up, and that even includes futures. All right, that's it. We've got our hello world on the screen. We've got our console logs. Everything is rerunning with the watcher. We're ready to go. The next step is going to be all about that HTML macro that we saw briefly, DOM builder, all that sort of getting UI on the screen. So stay tuned for rendering.